Really want to thank you all for coming, and now we'll turn it over to our featured presentation, Mr. Mark Gilbert.
Okay, thank you. So I was really excited when Claudia brought the magazine article to me, and I started reading through it, and then she said, "Why don't we do this presentation?" And we got, sort of snowballed in the discussion like she was describing, and then I have to confess there was another aspect to it that really related to what I was working on. I've been working on this book for the last couple of years, and I'm in the final throes of publishing, and it's going to come out in another month. And part of what I was doing in that book is a similar kind of content. And so one of the things that I did in that book was I presented a lot of material regarding different ideas of where people say we're going in our evolutionary journey. And I thought, and then summarized it with common themes. And I said, wouldn't it be interesting to go back and look at some of the archive magazines that I didn't tap as part of putting that together and see what some of the articles wrote. So when Claudia brought the magazine article to me that she was referencing, which we're going to get into in just a few minutes, I thought, man, it would be really fantastic to then look at the other articles through a period of time and ask that same question, what themes came out of that? Setting aside what I'd already been working on, I'll come back and visit that hopefully towards the end, so give you a little sense of the themes that came out of that research. But tonight, what I want you to do is to help me do a little bit of research. So there's a question in this title, and it's our Humanity's Evolving Consciousness, What's Next? So you're probably curious what's next. So what we're going to be doing is going through for the next few minutes some magazine articles through the archives of Science of Mind magazine and giving you some of the highlights of those articles. And my charge to you over the next period of time is that one, when the lights, if they may go down here, is to stay awake will be the charge to you. And then the second one is to listen through these for themes. Okay? Are you with me on this? Okay, good. So that's my intention. We're going to review key points and articles over a number of years related to evolving consciousness, look for themes, and then consider how we can apply these in our life. Because I always think if you're going to do something and you're going to understand it from an intellectual standpoint, you also want to understand how you can actually apply it. But as I have a secondary goal for this tonight, and that's for you to start thinking more in terms of the archives and the magazine as a research resource for you. Because there's tons of stuff out there that James was talking about. So much stuff is online, and so much of the stuff that I did in putting together tonight's presentation really was me sitting at home researching the archives from my computer. Even though I work here in the building and often interact and go down and have the luxury of going down to the archives when James is here and looking stuff up, I did all of this research online, so you could too, is the key point. And so if you think about what topic you might be interested in from a research standpoint, if you're working on something on forgiveness, love, or spirituality, prayer work, you think of any of the kinds of topics that are typically the things that are captured in the magazine. They're all available to you. You don't have to come in here and look at this stuff. You can actually go into the website and get it. Tonight, we're going to go through a little presentation. We'll have some questions and discussion at the end. And then, as James indicated, we'll have a tour of the archives. This is the website that I went to. This is the current one that he said is going to be upgraded soon. But I can tell you it's very user-friendly as it is right now. And you can go in there, and one of the things I was basically doing is using that search button up at the top and typing phrases in and seeing what would come up. And then it would bring up the various issues and various articles and the various books. Very simple to use. And so the question that I started off with, again with the magazine article from Claudia, was to ask the question, what do we mean by evolution? Okay, and what is the word evolution meant and been said in Science of Mind articles throughout the years? So the first thing I want to think is have us sort of stop collectively and think about what is evolution. What is evolution? All right? So this is the one piece I'm going to ask you to write up front to give me some reaction. And I'd like to just, anyone who has a thought about what evolution means to you, sort of throw the words out. Yeah?
Changing from where you are to something new.
Changing from where you are to something new. Okay. What else?
Expansion.
Expansion. What else?
Adaptation.
Adaptation. Okay. What else?
Growth.
Growth. Okay.
Forward moving.
Forward moving. Okay. Others.
Fulfilling potential.
Fulfilling potential.
Individually and collectively.
Individually and collectively. Very good.
Moving towards oneness.
Moving towards oneness.
Energy of creation.
The energy of creation. Okay. If I was sitting in front of a room of scientists, do you think we got a slightly different answers? But, oftentimes in our current culture, the term evolution has a very limited concept to most people. Evolution typically means Darwinian evolution. It means the survival of the fittest, the physical evolvement of species through time, through mutation and survival of the fittest and natural selection. And that process is often sort of collapsed into the only meaning of the word evolution. And so what I want us to do, and most of you are already on the same page with me by the answers that you were given, is that we have a more expansive idea of evolution as we go through this presentation tonight. That you want to consider that evolution is not only that physical Darwinian evolution that has actually occurred, but there's actually another kind of evolution that's been occurring, and that's in the world of the non-physical, i.e. in our consciousness, in our learning, in our development. And we also heard the words individually and collectively. I want you to consider that it's also playing out not only in our own lives, but it's playing out in the lives of all of the planet collectively. So, although we're going to look at a little bit of Ken Wilber later on in this, you can think of it in terms of his quadrants, where we're looking at things from an internal standpoint, an external standpoint, an individual standpoint, and a collective standpoint. Okay. To hold that broad definition in mind, here's the 1952 issue that Claudia was mentioning, cover of it. And here's just so you can see what articles look back like in 1952 out of the magazine. Here's the actual first page of the article. It's written by G.H. Palian. Anybody here know G.H. Palian? Okay, then I can say anything I want about him. Good question. Good point. But actually, one of the key things, and I'm just going to give you some highlights out of this article, was one of the key points he made right off the bat was that coming out of the release of the atomic energy in the previous decade, he felt like this was a milestone event in humanity's evolution. And he said that the release of atomic energy was ushering in what he called a fifth kingdom of consciousness. A fifth kingdom of consciousness. So again, keep on your hats since you're looking for themes here, folks, as we go through this. I want to keep that, you're looking for any connections between all of this. He said the first kingdom was mineral, second kingdom was vegetable, third kingdom were the animals, and the fourth kingdom were the men of the present time. Okay? But what he felt like was the fifth kingdom was a kingdom of consciousness, and that's where we were going from mankind to consciousness. Well, that's an interesting thing, because as soon as I heard that, I thought, man, Ernest Holmes said that a number of times in a number of different ways. Here's one way in which he wrote it in the Basic Ideas of Science of Mind. He said, we often hear the expression, consciousness sleeps in mineral life, dreams in plant life, awakens in animal life, and comes to self-consciousness in man. Man then stands at the very peak of the evolutionary climb. He's now a self-conscious individual, which means that not only he knows, but that he knows that he knows. Okay. There are several quotes from Holmes that have that very similar theme of moving through that sequence of kingdoms. Palian goes on with some other quotes I think you'll find are interesting. He says, with the birth of the new age, the old world, our present civilization, is gradually dying. And the new kingdom, the new era, that's the one of consciousness, is taking form, bringing with it new conditions, new laws, new values, new initiatives, new opportunities, and new responsibilities. He goes on to quote Albert Einstein's comment about a new type of thinking is essential to mankind to survive if we're to move toward higher levels. And then says, what is the new type of thinking, and how can we prepare ourselves and our children for the consciousness of these new higher levels? Well, he then points out what he says is the process that we need to look at. And he says progress is basically can be divided into what he considers horizontal and vertical growth. Horizontal growth is much like what Darwinian evolution was. That's when we see a slow progress over time, where it's so slow that it seems that it's very small and incremental. Whereas the vertical progress often occurs in leaps, where there's a major leap from one area to the next area. And that's where he said we were on the precipice of. We're on the precipice of moving from the fourth to the fifth kingdom, this leap into a new development or a new kingdom of consciousness. And he also said that therefore you got to look at progress occurs as a spiral. You heard the quote that Claudia read a few minutes ago. But he basically said we're always alternating between the horizontal and the vertical growth as part of our evolution. He also says when evolution moves from the horizontal to the vertical, a reversal of direction takes place. It's like in geometry, where the higher plane is found by a line projecting perpendicular to the one below it. Or when the sands of time run out in an hourglass and Father Time reverses the glass and starts a new era. The line of progress isn't a straight line, but a spiral. He says mankind is now passing through a transition, a period of mental confusion, doubt, suspicion, mistrust, misunderstanding, and conflict. Goes on from there to say the men of the old order oppose everything that the men of the new order want to introduce into this world. They don't want to change their way of life. Sounds like today, doesn't it? I mean, if you think about it. When Claudia said it sounds like something could be written today, I mean, you're reading through this and hearing, man, it's almost like commentary on the current events that are going on the planet. But what is this fifth kingdom that we're moving into? And the characteristics of where Palian says that we are going is that he sees a positive use of atomic energy occurring. This is one I'm not too sure I believe, when I'm reading. That's the one piece that might be a little dated in my mind, but if we could find a way to actually use this positively, then maybe he's right. But given this was written in 52, and I'm thinking he's on that cutting edge of this is new technology, and it meant something new to him. He also said the nature of this fifth kingdom of consciousness is one of less competition and more cooperation. That there's going to be expansion of new creative powers. And by that he meant not only us showing up and expressing our creative abilities that we came to the planet with, but also our recognition that we have that creative ability through our thoughts and actions. There's an expanded group consciousness that's a characteristic of this new kingdom we're moving into. And by that he means that we are aware that we are part of a greater whole that we're all connected to. That's what he means. That there's a breakdown in borders, so there's a sense of internationalism, and there's the birth of new religions on the planet. And by that he means new religions that show up in focusing on love, freedom, and abundance. And so those of you who are involved with science of mind know that key tenets of this teaching would be one that is indicative of a new religion. But we can also look out at other things going on in the planet, other expressions of even traditional Christianity, with stuff like Joel Osteen and his abundance teaching that gets to that same concept that we're moving in all of our religions into a development of focusing on a new kind of religion. So that's some key things you want to keep in mind there about where Palian says we are going. He says the New Age presents to us the greatest opportunity in the history of the world. Shall we consider this opportunity as our responsibility to mobilize our forces to create a new heaven and a new earth? Change or perish is the order of the day. There's no room for compromise. Mankind can only be saved through timely action. So who is this guy or woman? I was curious after reading this article. So I started off my little research thing by saying, well, let's just plug his name in on the archive website and see what comes up. And sure enough, there's a number of other articles written by him on Science of Mind magazine. I will say the very first step was in the magazine. I looked for his bio and it wasn't there. Which most of the bios, short bios, are in there now. But at this point in time, there wasn't anything. But there were, from the archives, a number of other magazine articles written in the early 50s by this guy. And I got curious, so I went and looked at each of them. Didn't get any bio out of him, but in some cases, his name was listed as George rather than G.H. So that set me off looking on the internet to find out about this guy. The other interesting thing I found out when I did a search was that there was another person writing magazine articles in Science of Mind at the same period of time who went under the name Francis or F. Palien. Now that's an odd name, so I figured there might be a slight connection between the two, don't you think? So then I went off and started searching on her, and lo and behold, she was somebody who wrote for a group called Astara. I think I'm saying that correctly. Anybody here familiar with the group? Yeah, it's a theosophical New Age thinking that's very much in alignment with Science of Mind. Okay, and they've been around for a number of years. And in fact, they still exist. They're still out there, still have a website. And so off on their website, I found a bio about Frances where she lists as her father somebody named Garabed Palien. Okay, well, let's put. I wonder who Garabed Palien is, and then the interesting thing is that as I'm moving along and finding out, checking this research on it, I find that as part of the Astara publication, it has this quote in it. It says, Francis's father, physicist Garabed Palien, was an associate and friend of prominent Mount Wilson Observatory astronomer Gustav Stromberg, author of the book The Soul of the Universe and the Searchers. So that's Gustav Stromberg. Well, interestingly enough, he wrote an article he wrote a column in Science of Mind for a number of years. Yeah. Are you with me? All right. Who's G.H. and Garabed or George? And his daughter Frances is of Garabed's, says in her bio that he was an associate of this guy who wrote an ongoing column in Science of Mind. I'm starting to think they're connected and one of the same. I then go on to find in Fenwick Holmes' bio of Ernest 2 references to Ernest being friends with Gustav Stromberg. So if Ernest is friends with Gustav, and Gustav is associates with Garabed, who's mother of Frances, don't get too dizzy on that, then I'm getting to think that maybe this guy is Garabed. But here's the other thing that was the kicker for me. I went off and found this website. Now, C. Alan Anderson has a website. He wrote a bio on New Thought history. Okay, New Thought history is the umbrella of which Science of Mind is and as well as Unity and other things. And this picture was on his website, and I copied here the caption. It says, artist Frances Palien with Helga Stromberg and Helen Palien, mother of Frances, present a star with oil portraits of Robert, the late astronomer Dr. Gustav Stromberg, and the late Garabed Palien of Bell Laboratories. New clue. And both scientists were noted in their fields and authored several lessons for Astara. Well, I sort of figured I went down the rabbit hole far enough, and that I probably had made enough to conclude that Garabed Palien was actually this guy's name. And then doing some research on him, found that at the time that he lived here, that he wrote a biography on this guy named Nicholas Roerich, which I wasn't familiar with, but that's an interesting rabbit hole if you want to go down it, because he was an artist who very much was in alignment with New Thought thinking. And also wrote a book on a non-technical exposition of the theory of relativity and its philosophic consequences. In other words, relativity and reality. And we also know he wrote for Astara, Bell Labs, and he also wrote a number of Science of Mind articles. So I thought, well, I'm way off on my theme thing, looking for themes into the future, and I won't do this on every other person, but I only did it for the sense that I found it interesting, and I spent all this time doing it, so I probably should share it. But let's look at some other themes. And so in my research on the archives website, I just got to say that you plug in the word evolution and you get tons of stuff. And I had to start limiting it and picking and choosing the better ones. But I only did that after I looked at this article. And this was from later on in the same year, December 52. There was an article called Spiritual Evolution. And I thought, well, I've got to read this one and see what it says. Written by somebody named Maurice Kent Malloy. I didn't go off researching that person. I do not know who they are. And if I really was curious at that point, I probably would have just called James and asked him to find out for me. But here's some key concepts. Here's the key concepts out of this article. Back to looking for themes, folks. Okay. What Maurice says is that the action of God appears in a perfect and orderly sequence that man has labeled laws. The principle impelling the sequential action of life is God. Principle, God, in sequence, is an ever upward spiraling to infinity. There's that spiral thing. Man, if left in that spiral, would also ascend easily and effortlessly in human experience until he had passed from the ken of mortal existence, moving on to another and larger and more beautiful mansions contained within the Father's house. Principle, that is God consciousness, is perfect and unceasing in its ascendancy. What he's basically saying is that God is perfect, and we're in that action of perfection going up in a spiral, and that we can just basically go on. And if we're unimpeding the law, then we'll just evolve. But, he says, and see if you can relate to this, people, place finite ideas into that infinite law. In other words, we limit ourselves by our thinking. We limit and think we can't do something, we're not good enough, and so forth. And whenever we place those limits, it causes an interruption into that infinite flow that's going to be taking us on up. Maurice goes on to say that we either must see God as all, or admit there's God in something else. So which is it? Which are we going to see here? Key point he makes is that seeing separation creates separation and slows down our evolution. So the flip of that is to see unity and interconnectedness of everything, and that speeds up your evolution. Okay. So allow God's machine to operate unimpeded, he says, by getting your smallness out of the way. Well, all right, let's jump ahead to another issue. You can see we're now up to 1967. I did go rather rapidly there, so we're not going to go through every year. But this was an interesting article because it caught my attention for a couple of reasons. One is, it was the cover article in September 67. You see, a scientist views cosmic evolution. Curious. And the interesting thing is it was a two-part feature. It was written by a guy by the name of Harlow Shapley. And it started in this issue here, Life, Hope, and Cosmic Evolution, continued on into the October 67 issue in Part 2, Man's Potential Destiny. In other words, where the heck are we going? And so this is Shapley. Now, who is Shapley? There was a little bio info on him there, and it was easy to find him more on the web. He was an American astronomer. He worked at the Wilson Observatory. Interesting connection there again, with Edwin Hubble in the early part of the 20th century. And he also wrote a book on science, Ponders Religion. So this is one of those scientist religion guys, even like we have today. They were back in the day. We've had these guys who were always trying to meld science and religion together. Okay. So here are some key concepts from the two articles that Shapley wrote in 67. He said that early in human history, our thoughts were all focused on basic survival needs. Then we began living in societies, and by living in societies, that required us to think in cooperative ways. And then, because we were working in cooperative ways, our expansion of people that we're interacting with are not just our people that are immediately around us, but there are people who come and go from our community, and so now they're going over the horizon. So the world must be bigger than we thought. So that was an expansion of our thinking of what life was. It was first just where we were, but now we know there's people living somewhere else. And because we're cooperating and we're trading and so forth, now we have this expanded view of the universe. Our mind has opened up to the possibilities that it's not just us in our little hut or our cave, where there are now people living elsewhere. Okay? And then he says science then goes on to show humanity and the earth are not the center of the universe. So that ultimately all of science, as it progresses along and finds that there's this, the earth is revolving around the sun in some remote aspect of the solar system that's part of the Milky Way, that's part of our grander universe, the more and more that science uncovers this for us, the more that we have a sense of this expansiveness of the universe. Okay. One of the quotes he said in there is, should man not abandon his primitive beliefs about his spot in space and time, his one planet religion and one planet deity? Should he not ask for a reorientation, a religious philosophy that encompasses the newly known and which is not continuously in retreat? Perhaps the traditional concept of deity should be abandoned entirely. Wow. So we need to let go of our limited view of God, is what he's basically saying. Why should we not expect the great growth urge that runs through the universe to include the growth of man's groping philosophies? The answer is that we do expect it. Even evolution itself evolves. That we have this impulse within us to grow, to evolve. There is something within us that's pushing us forward in our lives. He then goes on to talk about the thoughts of the day regarding physics and where we see the world and the planet and how it works together. He says that the basic entities of the universe are commonly recognized to be space, time, matter, and energy. The first two can be linked together as space-time, and the others as mass energy. It's difficult to think of any universal quality that's other than these four. And from a materialistic scientific viewpoint, that's where things stop. They say we have space-time and mass energy. And all of the world can be explained by the materialistic looking at these things. But what Shapley opens our eyes to is the question about what about direction? What about the actual impulse that put together this whole idea of space-time, mass energy, and a seeming direction in which it's moving? And so he says to him, there must be something else. But if there's not some additional entity, a fifth one that would be necessary if you had the assignment of creating a universe, how about the vague abstractions like drive and direction and original breath of life administered by the Almighty, or as he calls it, cosmic evolution? Cosmic evolution naturally takes care of such matters as the origin of life. The progression's clear and rational throughout the whole course. Atoms grow to stars, cells grow to man. It's a natural part of that progression that's put there by this fifth entity, cosmic evolution, God, direction, whatever name you wish to give it. He says only at the beginning and only at the end do we have a sort of a vagueness about how it all sort of fits. There's a mystery regarding how we arose out of the origin of hydrogen and the Big Bang, or where the universe may be going. But we can't argue with the fact that there seems to be some direction to it, this concept of cosmic evolution. And here's what he says cosmic evolution basically is, and some of the concepts that we need to keep in mind. The cosmic evolution occurs in two realms. It occurs in the physical realm. There's no doubt we've had physical evolution. But it also occurs in the world of consciousness and in our thoughts. And we have to acknowledge and recognize that there is a growing direction to consciousness evolving also. He says that cosmic evolution works at the smallest levels and at the largest. There's a pattern of evolution occurring at the molecular level, but there's also evolution occurring at the cellular and universal levels. And there's an evolutionary pattern that's embedding everything that is. That there are directions that we can see all along the way from the small to the large and the inner and the outer. And that's the direction towards cooperation, altruistic behavior, charity, mutual respect. He sees something called the rising of what he calls a new kingdom. Only here he calls it the psychozoic kingdom, or as he described that, it's the growing dominance of mind. Mind. He says to advance, we need to turn from the animal to the spiritual. This includes an emergence within us of a reverence for all of life. Starting to see any themes so far? Yes? Okay. Well, we're going to jump through time, and now we're jumping up to January 1984. And this one really caught my eye because I'm a big Ken Wilber fan, and you'll see in a minute there's a couple of articles that I wrote in Science of Mind. One's on Ken Wilber, which we'll look at in a second. But I thought, all right, how many of you in here are familiar with who Ken Wilber is? That's most of the group. We're going to do a little bit of what Ken Wilber tonight, but it's going to be rather rapidly. But I want to just say Ken Wilber's thinking is somewhat complex, but it's the key concepts I think can be grasped pretty quickly. But if you want to know more, there's lots of resources. And I encourage you to look at some of the resources that were in the Science of Mind. You can go get these magazine articles and read them in full online. So anything that I'm sort of highlighting here, you can go read the whole thing later and see if you can test me, see if I was right on it. So anyway, the interesting thing about this is Ken Wilber, who's become fairly well known in recent years, this is back in 1984 when he was first beginning in his philosophical career, and his first book had come out called Spectrum of Consciousness. And Science of Mind magazine did a 2-part interview with him, not only in this issue, but it carried over into February of 84 for part 2 and its conclusion. Now, who is Ken Wilber? Most of you raised your hands. Most of you know he's a philosopher. He lives here in Denver. Part of that, he was in Boulder. Used to live in California. He's a father of what's called the integral theory. That's what he's most known for. He's written over 30 books that develop his concept of the integral model, which we're very quickly going to look through some of the key concepts of tonight. But I want to first focus on this article from 1984, 2-part interview with him, where he was basically interviewed after his first book. Now, one of the key things that came out in his first book was in Spectrum of Consciousness was the description of what is the spectrum of consciousness. And what Wilber basically aligned a spectrum of consciousness as is something that was related to what's a familiar tradition in many religions, and that's something called the Great Chain of Being. Now, what the Great Chain of Being basically says is that there is a spectrum of life that came out of Spirit or God. That basically God or Spirit was all-inclusive and involves everything, but that it started stepping itself down in lower gradations. And that in those lower levels, it did that for, different people have different reasons as to why that occurs, but the most common description is that's the way Spirit now opens itself for a new experience of itself. That it's basically stepping itself down so that life now forgets that it knows that it's part of Spirit and then can have life that's where it feels like it's separate from Spirit, and that's a unique experience for Spirit. Is that making sort of a weird sense? Okay? That's one of those head rattlers for a lot of people, but the key idea here is to think that if you knew everything that there was to know about all time and all space and everything that was ever existed, what's the one thing you might not know? What it was like to be separate from that. And so if I can move myself into being separate from that and have experiences of being separate, then I can have something I don't have, and then I have an enhanced experience. Okay. See me later if you want more on that. But the idea, what I'm really trying to get you to see is that Spirit then in its oneness stepped itself down. And then this has become something where it stepped itself down into soul or subtle bodies, down into mind, down into life, and then down into physical matter. That basically what Spirit did was infuse itself down into lower and lower gradations of itself, so that at the lowest levels it's not aware that it's part of Spirit. Okay? This is often called involution. Spirit involves itself into its manifestation. Okay? But Spirit doesn't leave us there stranded, feeling separate. Spirit wants us to return home, so Spirit calls us back. And that's evolution, where we evolve back in our awareness into an understanding of that we came from unity to begin with. Okay? So Wilber's concepts were to tie what he called a spectrum of consciousness. Now, what is a spectrum? Think of it in the terms of a light spectrum or a set of gradations here, and you're moving through different steps. We're basically stepping down like a ruler, and you're getting farther and farther away from the sense of Spirit. But the key thing that Wilber wants us to remember is even though we're sensing that we're away from Spirit, we're never really not part of Spirit. We're always in it. It's just that our awareness has been going down from it. Okay? And so that when physical matter at its lowest level is not aware of its spiritual nature, but as you move back up the great chain of being from matter evolves into life. Life evolves into an expression of mind. Mind into soul. Soul into spirit. As we move back up that chain of being, we move back into our recognition of our oneness. There's concepts in a lot of traditions. This is the Kabbalist tree of life. Many of you may be familiar with the Kabbalah and the teachings of mystical teachings of Judaism. And I'm not going to go through this, but if you were to go and read about this, you see the same sort of thing. The top of this is spirit, the bottom is the kingdom of matter, and in between are the various stages of awareness as it steps itself down from spirit into physical form. Just another way of saying the great chain of being. According to Wilber in his article, though, he says material evolution, which we tend to focus on, is only half our story. The spiritual path is necessary to continue our evolution. So our physical growth has only taken us so far. Where we're going next is on a spiritual path, and our evolution is in higher levels. It's in that higher stratum of that spectrum of consciousness. We're now moving into the spiritual realm of it. He says that important for us on that spiritual path is to do meditative and contemplative practices, because these develop that sense of our oneness and connectedness to other things. He says that humanity naturally goes through all these developmental stages in all of our areas of lives, but it's at the higher stages that we start sensing wholeness, harmony, and unity. Wilber had a name for it that he calls the Atman Project. You take it from the Hindu, the concept of Atman Brahman, Atman being ego, Brahman being the oneness, and that in our sense of ego and humanness, we're moving ourselves back into oneness. So, what's interesting for me is that our Science of Mind symbol has this V in it. And sometimes when I've taught classes in Science of Mind, I've often also brought in how the V can be an indicator, a reminder for us about this evolutionary evolution path that we're on. Now, the typical way we teach the symbol is, of course, everything is universe. Up at the top is consciousness, and that as our consciousness moves downward through soul or law, we receive the manifestation of it in the physical form. So the top is our consciousness, the middle is law, and the bottom is physical form. So as we think at the top, it moves through law, we create our life at the bottom. That's how we normally teach the Science of Mind symbol. And we do that from both a macro look at it from all of everyone, and spirit it collectively, and also the micro of our own lives and our own thinking. But you could also look at the V as a representation of a downward arc from spirit into physical form. That's part of the involution of spirit moving us into this physical life, and the upward V moving us back into unity and oneness and our realization of spirit. A few quotes from Holmes. Okay? Ernest Holmes, who wrote so much on evolution that it's just rich to pick from, just a few to share tonight. He says, "The awakening is a process of evolution. A little here and a little there, until the whole eye is opened and we see that life is neither separate from God nor different from good. Life is God, and good is the only power there is or can be." Here's another way he said it. "Christ is the supreme ideal which Jesus made manifest through the power of the Word. Christ is the divine nature of all being and the supreme goal of union towards which all individual and collective evolution moves." One more. "The Immaculate Conception, the Virgin Birth, and those things which we tie into traditional theology are as old as time. And they stand for the concept of the originating creative power or principle, God, and the Word of God, operating through all things. This was called the Spirit of God operating upon the soul of God, or the Mother-Father principle. It means that the divine creative Word operates in the physical universe, planning itself there by involution, and then by evolution, reaching back to heaven to complete the cycle of creation." Those are just a couple of examples, but you can go find lots of Ernest where he talks about this process of us being cast out and evolving back into a sense of oneness. Another quote from Wilber. "The idea is that we can continually awaken higher modes of knowing, and those higher modes of knowing disclose successively higher levels of existence. And those revelations culminate, according to the mystics and sages, in absolute transcendental spirit, which is at the same time the evolutionary return of spirit to itself, the culmination, the omega point, the supermind, the superconscious state, which marks the final culmination of evolutionary return to spirit." See how they're all saying the same thing here. Let me just quickly run through this concept, which was part of his interview as well. human developmental stages, that we tend to focus first on the material, the body, then the mind. That's generally where our development stops. But that if we can continue on with our spiritual development, we can grow and evolve into the subtle or soul levels of our life, and then the causal or spiritual level. And that's why the spiritual path is so important for us to move that way. To move upward, he has the phrase, you transcend but include the lower level. So as you develop your physical or body, you keep that with you and take it to the next step as you're now working on your mind. And as you develop your mind, you now take that with you as you now work on the next levels of your development. Similarly, human collective evolutionary history has gone through stages where back before, in the earliest days of cavemen, people tend to lump that into something called the archaic level, but that at some point man awakened to a sense and started to try and explain the universe, and that became our sense of magic and looking around and explaining things through magical terms. Eventually that rolled into our new religions, our traditional religions like Christianity and Judaism and so forth, where they're mythic in their nature, where they're using myth to explain their truth. But ultimately science opens us up to recognizing that there's a rational way of looking at life. And he says that the next step beyond the egoic, rational way of looking at life, which is what's embedding so much of our current culture, is something called the causal level of development. And but humanity at a certain point in time has an average level and a pioneer level. He says if you go back and look at a particular point in time where people were living like in the times of, say, Jesus and Buddha, they might have been on the cutting edge, the pioneers, where the traditional people who were in that area only understood them from their level of understanding. But at every time in history, there's always the average level, and then there's the people who are at the cutting edge of the growth and development of humanity and pushing along to the next level of growth. And that's the folks you want to watch because they're telling us where we're going. Okay? Here's a rather long quote, and I hate to read slides to you, but let's look at it anyway. Wilber says, I'm saying that rationality is really just now fulfilling its potential and ultimately will be dropped and shed in favor of the next collective stage of growth, which will start to be the genuinely trans-rational and not pre-rational stage. By that what he means by that is that if you think from a rational, if you're a rational thinker, things are either rational or non-rational. You're either rational or you're not. But he's trying to say there's a level before becoming rational, but there's a level after rational. And you've got to recognize that there's new ways of knowing and understanding things that can come into place after the rational level. So don't just label everything that's not rational as not being rational. It can be beyond the level of rational and be good, be right. Okay. Religion will truly come into its own. Rationality will remain a part of our mental capacity, of course, but as a servant, not a master. I think this could take place within as little as several decades, but more likely within several hundred years. And so as we start to find the average mode of consciousness being one which is represented by yogis and so later by saints and then sages, there, I believe, is our collective future. Not merely as a future shared by a few individual adepts, but a global community of the spiritually alive. That's where he says we're going. That was in 84. All right, we're going to jump ahead. This is 2010. And I'm going to cut to this one real quickly. And I had to include it because it was one I had written. And but I thought it was a logical next step because this was an article about Wilber's integral theory. And so in here, I'm sort of taking him forward because his theory developed from 84 on, and again, 30 books and so forth. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I want to give you sort of a flavor of how his teachings have developed since then. He's actually come up with something he calls the AQAL model, AQAL, which stands for all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all types, all... I left something out, stages maybe. But the point being that he basically sat down and said everybody everywhere has some truth. And what we need to do is find a roadmap that we can pull the truth out of everything, put them together in new ways, overlay them on one another, and see what truths and insights they give us. And this is where Wilber's work is really so valuable. He's went out and looked at science, philosophy, and religion, just like Ernest Holmes did, looking for truths in all of them, and tried to put them together and make a map out of them. Holmes did it and called it science of mind. Wilber calls it his integral theory. Okay. One of the key concepts is the quadrants. I touched on this briefly at the beginning. Quadrants basically says anything, and let's keep it in the human realm, but I want to say when he talks about this, he means anything from an atom to a star, a plant, an animal, anything that is a whole in and of itself, and it's made up of other wholes, and is part of another whole. Okay? You're made up of little molecules and organs and so forth, and you're also part of a society and other stuff. So you're in the middle of you're whole by yourself, but you're part of another whole, and you're also made up of wholes. Okay, so everything is, if you stop and look at it that way. We said anybody, if you take anything from that standpoint, it has 4 perspectives on life. The 4 perspectives are, it knows itself in its outer world. And that's the outside over here. So if you look on the black lines and the 4 squares, the right-hand side is all the exterior. So Wilber says everything has a sense of life from the exterior. So as we look out, as you're listening to me, you're hearing and we're interacting. So that's that exterior aspect. It's occurring both on the individual level, your own life and your sensory stuff, but there are also aspects of us living together on the exterior level. So you can think in terms of our social systems, churches, and our politics and government and things like that are all collective external things. We all experience life also on the interior. Interior, on the upper left-hand quadrant, is things that are inside of your individual awareness. So your consciousness, your thoughts right now that might be going on in your mind are part of that internal awareness. On the bottom half of the chart, which is the collective, that inner area of our collective is our culture. It's our cultural agreements. We're in our inner awareness. We both have agreements on how things are going to be. Okay? So if you sort of think inside our heads, top left, what we're looking at the life from our own life, top right, how we all collectively agree on stuff that's outside of us, bottom right, and our internal agreements or cultural things, bottom left. In all of these areas of our life, Wilber points out we're evolving. And he uses a lot of developmental models to show that. He uses the concept of lines, which I'm only going to simply say, if you understand the concept of multiple intelligences, you've got a good handle on it. It's that we're growing spiritually, we're growing cognitively in our intellect, we're growing in our ability to play music, we're growing in things that we know, we are developing them and in higher levels. So when we are growing on the inside, that's that internal evolution. But we're also evolving on the outside. We've done that through our physical form, through the numbers of time, and that's probably less important for us at this point. But we can acknowledge that, and that's where Darwinian evolution tends to focus, is on that upper right quadrant, and individual evolution, and perhaps a little on the bottom right. The bottom right, where we can look at things we're evolving right now. Here's an interesting one, just as a teaser for you. Think about technology changing. iPhone 5 came out. All right. Every time something evolves technologically, that's the bottom right. Okay? But that's not the only thing. Our levels of government change. Our schools change. All of our systems that we're all working on the outside world, they're continuing to evolve as well. Our culture is evolving. If you think of what culture is like nowadays from how it was 100 years ago, you can say that we have developmental patterns. Every one of these areas, we can all sort of agree and acknowledge there's a pattern of growth that's occurring in each of these areas. Okay. Now, going to leave Wilber, and we're going to jump to this article that was also in 2000, going back a little bit, that one was in 2010, the one that I did on Wilber. This is back in 2008, this particular issue. And the reason I jumped to it is because it has an article on this guy named Aurobindo. Now, Aurobindo, a fascinating character, and I'd encourage you to go find this February 2008 article, because Diane Morgan did a good job of quickly summarizing a very interesting life this guy had. And I'm not going to jump into his life, but just to simply say that he grew up in India and was very important in India politics at the first half of the 20th century. But he got involved with spirituality and started writing some spiritual journals, and eventually developed a book that is called The Life Divine. And The Life Divine is about, I want to say it's maybe, when it's published in one volume, it's maybe 6-7 inches thick. It's a major tome. And the interesting thing about that is there's a number of sources who quote that in the latter years of his life, Ernest Holmes read The Life Divine once every year. And I just think that's just amazing, because if you go look at that book, and I'm thinking, I've started it, and remember when you first anybody read Holmes and you first started and you didn't understand what he was saying? Yeah. Okay, it's because you didn't understand the lingo. And eventually you got to what he meant by the certain words, and then the more you did it, the more you read it, the more you understood it. Same thing with Aurobindo. You start reading him, and it's like, what does he mean by that? And and then all of a sudden you're having to stop and look up words, and then you're lost. And but he's fascinating if you can get into him. And apparently Ernest did, as did Wilber. Wilber quotes and cites Aurobindo a lot. In fact, Aurobindo is often cited as the first person who used the term integral and had what he called integral yoga. So, but a few things about Aurobindo that I think are key for you to know. He felt that divinity was embedded in humanity. This ultimate one, or Brahman, manifests itself in 7 latent forms: pure being, pure consciousness, pure delight, supermind, mind, life, matter. Don't worry about the levels, but what I want you to get there is that there's levels. Okay? And for Aurobindo, the story of Brahman or God is really a story of evolution. Quote from page 86 of the article. It says, "The divine begins its journey in matter, within which are coiled life, mind, and supermind. Life evolves from matter, and mind from life. This is where humanity is now in our development. Life and matter are fully evolved. Mind is somewhat, but not completely evolved. We still dwell in a state of ignorance and incomplete knowledge. But we were created for something higher and something better." She also quotes Aurobindo. There he is, picture of him. And I like that picture because he's sitting in a chair and there's Ernest sitting in a chair. So here's the 2 quotes from her article, though, side by side. When I started thinking about cutting this down, I said, I got to leave the picture then where they're both in the chairs. She says of Aurobindo, Aurobindo's quote, "Our life, still full of obscurity and confusion, and occupied with so many dull and lower aims, must feel all of its urges and instincts exalted and become a glorious counterpart of the supramental super life above." Ernest, evolution's the awakening of the soul to the recognition of its unity with the whole. Material evolution is an effect, it's not a cause. Now, I'm not going to cover all of this in the interest of time, but very quickly what Aurobindo had is this evolutionary arc where we're moving through different levels of mind. He says we've developed these lower levels, that we're moving on to these higher levels. When we fully develop all of these 5 lower levels of mind up through spiritual, that's not the end of the story. That we actually then go into something called supermind. And that supermind is, when that occurs, that there will be a new species born, one that embraces all forms of divinity. His integral yoga were techniques to develop this on this evolutionary path. Later in 2008, the article that Claudia mentioned that I wrote on spiral dynamics. And I'm going to try to do spiral dynamics in 5 minutes, and that's almost impossible to do. But I do want to give you the flavor of it, and I think some of the concepts we've already hit on, you'll hear and understand the connections between the other people that we've heard. Spiral dynamics is a popular name that was popularized by a couple of authors in the late 90s, Chris Cowan and Don Beck, who wrote a book based on the writings of a social psychologist named Claire Graves back in the 1970s primarily. He did his work in the 50s, 60s, 70s. He was a contemporary of Abraham Maslow. Many of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What Claire Graves did, he did studies on people. He did studies where he did tests of you, what your values were. And he did it in a number of ways. He did some tests where basically he would give you written instruments where you would score that and figure out what your value structure was. He would also show you words, and you'd have to react on buzzers and stuff, so he can measure how quickly you reacted and saw words. And there were different techniques that he used with different people, and he did it over time, which was a key thing, because when in longitudinal study, what he started finding was that people and their values could be grouped together into common sets of values, and that we all have a common set of values that guide how we look at life. And the key point was not only that we all have this limited number of sets of different common values that exist in humanity, but that we're evolving through them. That by watching people over time, he saw that we all went through the same sequence. And that you could watch people, that they would then develop through them and then typically stop in their development at one level. And that's how they looked at life. And all of their flavor and decisions and actions around life were through that lens of life. Okay? But that if we look ahead to the ones who've grown through those levels, we get a picture of where we're going. And that's the key thing for tonight. Okay? Now, here's a chart of it laid out in spiral sense, and I encourage you to go out and read some more on this and develop, because I think it's a fascinating theory, and it really does explain a lot. I'm not going to run through this whole chart, but here's another key thing I want you to understand, is that what we can see from this and what Graves' work did on it was that he could map individuals and their value structures changing over time. So he knew that people who were born onto the planet as an infant and then grew, we could see at different stages in life that people had their values as they moved to newer levels. But that as you look at the model, you also see that it also can explain the evolution of humanity over its history. That if we go back to the caveman and apply the worldviews, we can see that they were the appropriate worldviews at certain stages in our evolutionary path. And so that when we see them from an individual and from a collective standpoint, it sort of paints not only where your own life may be going when you're reaching the higher levels, but you can also see where humanity's going collectively by looking at those value structures. Okay? Now, I'm not going to cover all of these. I want to focus on primarily the ones that are blue, orange, and green: truth, force, strive, and human bond. Because these are the three that are primarily at work in human society right now. And as we look out at people in current U.S. culture, Western culture, most Americans live with one of these three worldviews. Blue, another word for blue, is the traditional worldview. So if you think of someone who looks at life in very black-white terms, that I like laws and written things. If you're going to give me a God, give me one in a book where I can read the words and I know what they said, and I can be very structured in it. If I know that life is about denying myself in this lifetime for some future gains, I like laws, structure, traditional values. Please don't change things, because I like things the way they are. If you're sort of sensing that there is a subculture within the U.S. that has that sort of mindset, and that's a very quick snapshot, okay? That would be the blue truth force way of looking at life. Now the question might come, how do you move from blue to the next level? If you meet, according to Graves and the other people who've worked on this, as you meet the level of your life conditions at one level, as you meet whatever the situation is you're currently dealing with, life opens up the next level for you. So it's sort of like, I meet this condition, life brings me the conditions that make me grow to the next level. Okay? So the key within spiral dynamics is always to say, how can we meet somebody where they are, to assist them where their life conditions are, so they can move beyond it on their own. It's not to come in from our worldview and impose something different on them. All right? So the next level, orange, is materialistic scientific mindset. So the Richard Dawkins of the world, the whole atheist movement, the people who look at everything from a materialistic scientific standpoint, the people who think things are either rational or not, that's that orange materialistic worldview. It's also the Wall Street people. It says those with the most toys when you die wins. The whole purpose of life is to accumulate goods and material things. Green is the people who say there's a great interconnection of everything. It's all about us humans. We've got to value that we're all unique and different, and let's value the perspective of everyone. All right? So very quickly, those are snapshots of them. There's more to it than that, but just keep those little snippets aside. What happens in our current society is that each of these individual groups, they talk to one another and they don't understand what each other's saying because they're looking at life differently. And one of the things that their data has shown is that if you're in one of these worldviews, you don't know the other worldviews exist. You're just thinking the other person's crazy.
Or a religious scientist.
Or that too, Clay. But the key thing, they said, is that there's higher levels. And what Graves found out back in the 1970s was, he says there's something called the monumental leap to second tier. And at the second tier of consciousness, up there where it's flex, flow, and whole view, yellow and turquoise, That's where you then now go, aha, I see that there's all these levels. And they're all serving us. They're all good. They're all part of our evolutionary path. There's all a benefit for this. There's a reason to this. Okay? And so it's when you make that leap into second-tier consciousness that you then now see things from a whole system perspective. You start seeing the interconnectedness of all alive. You start seeing that mind-body is not two separate things, that there's an interaction between the mind and body. Okay? And if you're interested, there's a whole... I do want to read one thing. And I am aware that I'm running up on my time here. But I wanted to read from that magazine article the description of second-tier consciousness, because I want you to think in terms of where are we going. Spiral dynamics shows that at the higher levels of consciousness, we begin to understand the big picture view of living systems and the evolutionary flow of life. Where chaos and change are considered natural, accepted phenomenon, we begin to see the role we play in our own evolution. At these higher levels, we begin to honor and respect other beliefs and worldviews without necessarily agreeing with them. We acknowledge the connection between spirituality and physics. We focus and see the good in all living entities. We expand the use of brain-mind tools for developing our consciousness. We see the individual self as part of a larger conscious spiritual whole that also serves the self. And we value the spiritual beliefs of all the other levels as we stand in awe of the overall cosmic order of things. And it goes on to there to talk about how our view of what God is has evolved through time. As we move up that level, what God is an evolutionary path to us. What we call God appears differently. Now, the interesting thing, and I thought if I'd had time, but I don't have time, is that Claudia, after I finished this whole presentation, she comes with that book that she's been reading with something from 1930. And I'm reading that thing going, oh, I got to work that in. The point being is that there is so much of this, and they're all through from 1930 through 2012 and into 2013, they're all saying very similar things. And I'm hoping you're seeing connections tonight. Let me give you just some quotes from some of the upcoming articles that are coming out.
They're all women.
I, for a while, thought you had to be named Kathy to get an article. But Anne, you were one of the exceptions there. But from Anne, who's here, she has an article called Birthing a New World, and I guess these could change as publication comes, but this is how Claudia shared them with me. But Anne writes about Barbara Marx Hubbard and her birthday 2012 movement, and how Hubbard calls for us to celebrate on 2012, in December this year, a new birth of human consciousness. She quotes Hubbard's description of how something's truly ending. Quote, whether it be from the Mayan prophecy, the environmental problems, or a series of other crises, a certain form of growth in consciousness has been increasingly destructive to human and earth life. As there is a time of things coming to an end, there's also a rising up of human creativity, consciousness, love, and wonderment. And so we're simply celebrating that emerging quality of divinity and calling it the birth of the next phase of human evolution. It's the celebration of our birth as a universal species. I'm going to read one more. I will tell you there are quotes from every one of these articles that have a very similar flavor to them. And I've selectively pulled them, but as you read them, it's like you go, aha, there it is again. Aha, there it is again. Kathy Hearn, in her article, The Emerging World, she writes about the major shifts that we all feel are happening at this time. She writes, quote, one way to view what's taking place is that a huge spiral of time of Earth's story is completing, while another huge spiral of time, a new cycle of Earth's story, is beginning. A lower frequency of consciousness centered in the belief in and perception of separation is dissipating, while a higher frequency of oneness consciousness is seeking to be welcomed into our awareness and our living. If it's true that the only problem is separation and the only truth is unity, then we, as the people between the spirals, have a role to play in ushering in the new. So, Did you see any themes? This is this point where I'd like you to tell me what you saw. Briefly. Anything that you saw. Spiral? Yeah? Okay, I'll give you one.
Evolution.
Okay, we're evolving. What else?
Involution, evolution.
Involution, evolution. There's a continuous process of spirit involved itself within us, and we're evolving back to spirit. What else?
Hope.
Hope. Hope.
We're moving toward oneness.
That we're,
Acceptance of everything and everyone.
yes, yes. Seeing that the ultimate goal is we're moving back to oneness, we can't help but have hope about that. You know, that there's an ultimate track back. Yes.
The leap, the horizontal and the vertical.
Yeah, there's both horizontal and vertical growth, that we are at a point where we're leaping. Yeah, it may not feel like it some days, but in this world of chaos, which is part of a natural order, we're going through a leap right now, and it's been perceived as far back as 60 years ago. What else?
Oh, Mark, the theme that I saw is that if we're not dipping back into our spiritual practice, that we're missing the evolution.
Right, right. There's a key aspect that to take us from the next, we've been animals in our evolution to this point. The next level of our evolution is spiritual. And how are we going to evolve in a spiritual realm, but other than following some spiritual path and doing spiritual practices that develop within us a sense of oneness and connectedness? Yes. What else?
And as we evolve our personal lives forward, we evolve the consciousness forward at the planet.
Each of us individually has a role to play, and as we develop our consciousness, we're helping the collective to evolve as well. We're doing it on the individual level, but we're part of that collective, and we can't help but uplift the planet's consciousness through our actions. Yeah. Anything else? No right or wrong here.
It's all divine, just showing up in different aspects.
Yeah. Everything is God. Everything is God. We've got to let go of that sense of separation. We can either see that everything's God or there's God and something else. Said it back in 52. We're still struggling trying to answer that question, aren't you? I know I am. All right, here's some that I saw, but some of you already said. The leaps, we're in a transition. Some things in the future, more cooperation, expanding creative abilities, borders less important, religion to spirituality, focusing on love, freedom, abundance. We play a role, our individual aspects of it. We know now that evolution is a fact, and we are a player in it. We've sort of gone along ignorantly, through the whole thing, and then now we have to say, which means if we know this stuff, what are you going to do with it? Other themes, God's Spirit's impelling the evolution. It's pushing us along. And Ernest, I love the concept of divine urge. Go read what Ernest wrote about divine urge. But divine urge is that aspect within us that's calling to express our unique creative talents. And Ernest called it an evolutionary force. Teilhard de Chardin called love an evolutionary force because love's pulling us out of our sense of separation. When you have a sense that you are connected to something by the power of love, and I always use an example of Harmony, my dog, because I can't help but look at her and just love her. But it's bringing me out of me to connectedness to her. Anything that does that's connecting me with other stuff. So how might we use this in our lives? We heard some of this already. Spiritual practices.
A sense of cooperation.
Developing a sense of cooperation. Seeing yourself as connected to others. Acceptance. Yeah. You know, and I'm going to do another shameless plug for my book, but it's in that I also point out that we're at this evolutionary juncture as well, and which way we're going to go with it. And the three ideas or three key critical things from my thinking in that to move us to that higher level is one, to focus on our being connected rather than focus on us being separate. So look for areas where we're alike rather than looking for ways we're different. Secondly is to understand there is this path and to look into that highest vision where we're going. Focus on, use the power of our thought. Set your intentions. If we're all setting intentions on the highest way of direction to where we want to go, then what power that would have in moving us in that direction. And the third thing in the book, which is called Being Yourself, is about actually being yourself, showing up in your authentic self, showing up what you came here to be, answering that divine urge that's in you that says you were called to do this or this or this. But by doing that, not only are you expressing yourself as Spirit gave you that life to express and expressing your unique talents, by doing that, you often are called, and I will say always, called to service to others. And because by coming to service, whatever it is, that you're an artist or a mother raising children or whatever it is the calling that you have within you, as you answer that calling and you do it, you can't help but give your love and support other people, and it grows us and evolves us. Here's a quote from Ernest from the Beverly Hills Lectures. Our movement will not depend on a talk such as I'm giving you now. Our evolution, what it will mean to the world, will not depend on the books we write or plug. It will depend on what we do with it. It will depend on someone knowing enough about it to cause something to happen because of what he knows. When he wants it to happen, where he wants it to happen, and the way it ought to happen, according to his own volition, proving that he is not subject to any whimsical caprice. Ernest is calling you to action. You now know, if you didn't already know, but now you know it, it's some deeper, interconnected way of the evolutionary path that you're on. You've looked at some of the articles out of Science of Mind that have been written over the last 60 years, and there were plenty more I could have drawn from, folks, that say the same thing. So now you know, and you know you know. All right. That ends this. I want to turn it back over to James, right? Are you coming? And he can talk about not only the... Thank you. And I want to thank you not only for attending the opportunity to do this, put all of this together, but also as just a reminder, this whole thing is to benefit the archives. You've seen this being